On that cold December night in 1973, screams from Doris Day's Beverly Hills home woke the neighbors. But by morning, no one would speak a single word about that night. The terror in Doris's eyes that evening was the final piece of a devastating secret she had carried for years. When the cameras stopped rolling, when the microphone went silent, when the applause ended, all that remained was the desperation of a woman imprisoned in a golden cage. Everyone who knew Doris Day remembers that legendary smile, that innocent expression on her lips as she sang Que Sera Sera, had touched millions of hearts across America. But no one knew that smile was actually a mask, carefully crafted to hide something much darker. Behind that mask were eyes filled with terror, and tonight you'll discover why. Before we continue with this incredible story, hit that subscribe button for more shocking revelations about Hollywood's golden age that were never meant to be told. Trust me, what you're about to hear will leave you speechless. The nightmare began in 1968, when Doris was at the absolute peak of her career. Her television show, The Doris Day Show, was dominating the ratings week after week. Her films were breaking box office records, and she seemingly had everything America dreamed of. But appearances in Hollywood have always been deceiving, and Doris's perfect life was the biggest deception of all. The man controlling every aspect of her existence was her third husband, Martin Melcher. To the public, he appeared to be the devoted husband and manager, always by her side, always protecting America's sweetheart from the harsh realities of show business. But Martin wasn't her protector. He was her captor, her warden, her systematic destroyer. And the prison he built around Doris was so sophisticated, so psychologically devastating, that she didn't even realize she was trapped until it was almost too late. The control began with small things that seemed loving and protective. Every phone call was monitored, under the guise of screening unwanted interruptions. Every appointment required Martin's approval to ensure it fit with her career goals. Even leaving the house needed his permission to maintain her carefully managed public image. "I'm protecting you from the vultures of Hollywood, darling," Martin would say with that charming smile that had fooled an entire industry. But behind that smile was a calculating mind that was methodically stripping away every piece of Doris's independence. What nobody knew, not even Doris herself for the longest time, was that Martin had been signing contracts and making business deals in her name for years. Her money, her property, her career decisions, even her personal relationships, nothing belonged to her anymore. She had become a prisoner in her own life, performing not just on stage and screen, but every waking moment, playing the role of the happy wife and grateful star while her soul was slowly being crushed. But the most chilling aspect of Martin's control wasn't financial or professional. It was psychological. He had been systematically documenting her private moments for years, collecting a horrifying archive of photographs, recordings, and intimate details that he used as weapons to ensure her complete obedience. The discovery of this surveillance would become the turning point that nearly destroyed her completely. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday in 1970. Doris was looking for some papers in Martin's home office when she accidentally opened the wrong drawer. What she found inside changed everything she thought she knew about her life. Hundreds of photographs showing her in private moments, audio recordings of conversations she'd had with friends, and detailed notes documenting her every mood, every doubt, every moment of vulnerability. Martin had been studying her like a laboratory specimen, learning exactly how to manipulate and control every aspect of her emotional state. When Martin found her standing there with the evidence scattered around her, his reaction was swift and terrifying. There was no anger, no surprise, just cold calculation. "Now you understand," he said quietly. "You belong to me completely. Your image, your reputation, your very identity. I control all of it. And if you ever think about leaving me, the world will see exactly who the real Doris Day is, underneath all that sweetness and light." From that moment forward, Doris lived in a state of constant terror. She knew that Martin possessed enough compromising material to destroy not just her career, but her entire sense of self. The woman who brought joy to millions was drowning in fear every single day, putting on that famous smile while dying inside. The psychological abuse escalated rapidly after her discovery. Martin began isolating her from friends and family, claiming they were trying to turn her against him. He hired private investigators to monitor her movements even when he wasn't present. Phone calls were cut short if he didn't approve of the conversation. Meals were controlled, claiming it was for her health and image. Sleep became elusive as Martin would wake her at random hours to discuss supposed threats to her career that required immediate attention. Most devastating of all, Martin began manipulating her perception of reality itself. He would move items in their home and then insist she had misplaced them. He would cancel appointments and then claim she had forgotten about them. He would intercept mail from family members and then tell Doris that no one had contacted her. Slowly, methodically, he was making her doubt her own mind, her own memory, her own sanity. During this period, those closest to Doris began noticing disturbing changes. Her once spontaneous laughter became forced and mechanical. Her eyes, which had always sparkled with genuine warmth, now carried a distant, haunted quality. When reporters asked about her happiness in interviews, she would recite answers that sounded rehearsed, as if she was reading from a script Martin had prepared. The financial manipulation was equally devastating. While Doris believed she was building wealth for their future, Martin was systematically looting her accounts. He invested her money in his friends' failed ventures, used her name to secure loans for his personal projects, and forged her signature on documents that would eventually leave her responsible for millions in debt. All of this was done with such skill and subtlety that Doris remained completely unaware of the financial time bomb ticking beneath her feet. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of Martin's control was how he weaponized her own success against her. Every achievement, every award, every moment of public adoration became another chain in his psychological prison. "Look how much you need me," he would say after a successful performance. "Without my guidance, you'd be nothing but a small-town girl with a nice voice. I made you into Doris Day, and I can unmake you just as easily." The breaking point came in 1972, during what should have been one of the happiest periods of her career. Doris was preparing for what would unknowingly become her final film, and the pressure from Martin had reached unbearable levels. The constant surveillance, the psychological manipulation, the complete absence of privacy had pushed her to the edge of a complete breakdown. It was during the filming of this movie that Doris discovered Martin's ultimate betrayal. Not only had he been controlling and robbing her, but he had been having an affair for years with a woman who was actively involved in the exploitation of Doris's career. The woman wasn't just Martin's mistress. She was his business partner in the systematic destruction of Doris's life. That night, for the first time in years, Doris confronted Martin directly. "How could you do this to me?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she faced the wreckage of her life. Martin's response revealed the true depth of his cruelty. "You think you have choices, Doris? You think you can just walk away? You are Doris Day because I allow you to be Doris Day. Without me, you're nothing but a broken woman with a past that would shock your precious fans." The threat was clear and devastating. Martin had documented not just her private moments, but had orchestrated situations designed to compromise her. Photographs taken out of context, conversations recorded without her knowledge, business meetings where she had expressed doubts about certain decisions, all of it carefully preserved as ammunition to be used against her if she ever tried to escape. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for both of them. On December 20th, 1973, Martin Melcher suffered a massive heart attack while dining at an expensive restaurant in Beverly Hills. As paramedics rushed him to the hospital, Doris followed, not out of love, but out of a complex mixture of duty, fear, and perhaps a desperate hope that his death might finally set her free. In the hospital room, as Martin struggled with his final breaths, he delivered one last act of psychological warfare. Through labored breathing, he whispered to Doris, "In the safe, there's a special gift waiting for you. You'll never escape me, even when I'm gone. You don't even know who you are without me anymore." What Doris discovered in Martin's private safe the next morning became the final chapter in her decades-long nightmare. Not only had Martin stolen virtually every penny of her fortune, over $20 million, but he had also prepared a devastating posthumous attack on her reputation. In addition to the millions in debt that were legally tied to her name through forged documents, Martin had arranged for his collection of compromising materials to be released to the media if anything happened to him. His lawyer arrived at Doris's home the morning after the funeral with an ultimatum that seemed to offer no escape. Mr. Melcher was very specific about his wishes, the lawyer explained with cold professionalism. Either you honor all financial obligations he incurred in your name, or his private collection of materials will be distributed to every major news outlet in the country. You have 48 hours to decide. The materials weren't just embarrassing personal moments. Martin had carefully curated a collection designed to destroy the innocent image that was Doris Day's greatest asset. Photographs taken during her most vulnerable moments, recordings of private conversations where she had expressed doubts and fears, and staged situations that could be easily misinterpreted by a scandal-hungry press. The threat was real, immediate, and seemingly inescapable. That evening, sitting alone in the mansion that had become her prison, Doris faced the complete destruction of everything she had worked for over 30 years. She had no money, no real friends left after years of Martin's isolation tactics, and no apparent escape from his final act of revenge. America's sweetheart was truly alone for the first time in her life. But as she sat there, surrounded by the ruins of her existence, something unexpected happened. Instead of despair, Doris felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Curiosity. Who was she without Martin's constant control? What did she actually think, feel, want, when no one was telling her what to think, feel, or want? For the first time in decades, Doris had to make a real decision about her own life. There was no script, no manager telling her what to do, no carefully constructed public image to maintain. And in that moment of complete vulnerability, she discovered something that Martin had tried for years to destroy, her own strength. The next morning, when the lawyer called demanding her decision, Doris surprised everyone, including herself, with her response. She laughed. It wasn't a bitter laugh or a desperate one. It was the sound of a woman who suddenly realized she had nothing left to lose and therefore everything to gain. Do it, she told the lawyer. Release everything. Let the world see who I really am. The lawyer was stunned. This wasn't the response they had expected from America's perpetually accommodating sweetheart. He stammered about the consequences, about her reputation, about the scandal that would destroy what remained of her career. My reputation? Doris asked, her voice growing stronger with each word. My reputation as what? As a woman who was so controlled she couldn't choose her own breakfast? As someone who was afraid to speak her own thoughts? That reputation is already destroyed. The only question is whether I destroyed it myself or whether I let Martin continue destroying it from the grave. But what happened next revealed something profound about celebrity culture and the machinery of public mythology. When Martin's materials reached news outlets across the country, something unprecedented occurred. They chose not to publish them, not out of respect for Doris personally, but out of a collective, almost unconscious understanding that some truths were too damaging to the national psyche. One editor from a major magazine later explained the decision in private. We realized that exposing Doris Day's pain wouldn't sell magazines. It would break hearts. In a world that was becoming increasingly cynical, she was one of the few symbols of pure innocence we had left. Destroying that would have been like burning down a national monument. This reaction revealed something both beautiful and tragic about Doris's situation. The same system that had enabled Martin's abuse by creating impossible standards of perfection was now protecting her from the consequences of that abuse. She was still trapped, not by one man's cruelty anymore, but by society's desperate need for innocence in an increasingly dark world. The realization that even in apparent freedom, she was still performing a role for others, led to Doris's most important transformation. She began to understand that true liberation meant disappointing people, meant allowing others to see her as flawed and human rather than perfect and untouchable. Her decision to retire from public life wasn't announced with fanfare or dramatic press conferences. She simply stopped answering calls from producers, stopped attending industry events, stopped being the person everyone expected her to be. The transition was anything but easy. For months, Doris struggled with intense anxiety about the most basic decisions. What to eat, what to wear, where to go. Choices that most people take for granted had become overwhelming challenges for someone who hadn't made independent decisions in decades. The simple act of choosing what book to read or what television show to watch became monumental exercises in self-discovery. But gradually, with the help of a small circle of trusted friends and a therapist who specialized in helping abuse survivors, Doris began to rediscover herself. She learned to distinguish between her own thoughts and the internalized voice of her controller. She practiced saying no to things she didn't want and yes to things that brought her genuine pleasure, regardless of what others might think. During this period of recovery, Doris began keeping a journal, something Martin had explicitly forbidden during their marriage. Hidden in a simple notebook, she documented her journey back to herself, recording thoughts and feelings that were authentically her own for the first time in decades. March 15th, 1974. Today I ate ice cream for breakfast because I wanted to. Such a small thing, but it felt like a revolution. June 3rd, 1974. I realized today that I don't actually like the color pink very much. Martin always said it was perfect for my image, so I wore it constantly. But I think I prefer blue. How strange to discover your own preferences at 50. November 20th, 1974. A young actress wrote to me, asking for advice about handling Hollywood pressure. I told her, the most dangerous person in your life isn't the critic who tears you down. It's the person who claims they're protecting you while they're actually imprisoning you. The woman who emerged from this process of self-discovery was neither the public Doris Day nor the broken victim Martin had tried to create. She was quieter but more confident, less performative but more genuine, scarred but ultimately much stronger than anyone had imagined possible. In her later years, living quietly with her beloved animals on a ranch far from Hollywood, Doris found something she had never experienced during her decades of fame: genuine peace. She chose her own schedule, her own friends, her own activities. She laughed when she felt like laughing, cried when she needed to cry, and spoke her mind without calculating the effect on her image. When young people in the entertainment industry would occasionally seek her advice, Doris would share the wisdom she had paid so dearly to acquire. Success without freedom is just an elaborate form of slavery, and freedom without the courage to disappoint others isn't really freedom at all. The financial struggles continued for several years, as Doris worked with lawyers to untangle the web of debt and fraud Martin had created. But she approached these challenges with a determination that surprised those who had known her during her years of captivity. She was no longer the passive victim who had allowed others to make every decision for her life. Through careful legal work and the support of friends who had never given up on her, Doris was eventually able to recover enough of her stolen assets to live comfortably. More importantly, she recovered something far more valuable: her sense of self-worth that wasn't dependent on public approval or professional success. The true measure of her transformation came years later, when a documentary filmmaker approached her about telling her story publicly. After careful consideration, Doris declined, but her reason revealed how completely she had reclaimed her life. "My story belongs to me now. I spent 30 years performing for others, and I have no intention of performing my pain for their entertainment." Her final diary entry, written decades after Martin's death, captured the ultimate resolution of her journey. "Today I realized I can sing Que sera sera again, without feeling afraid, not because I believe whatever will be, but because I finally understand that I have some say in what will be. The cage is open, and I choose to stay free." The golden cage that had imprisoned America's sweetheart had indeed been opened. But more than that, it had been demolished entirely. Doris Day had not just escaped her prison. She had learned to build her own life on her own terms. Flaws and all, fears and all, but finally, completely authentic. Years later, when asked by a close friend what she would want people to remember about her life, Doris smiled. A real smile this time, not the manufactured one that had graced 1,000 movie screens, and said simply, "I hope they remember that it's never too late to save yourself." The screams that had echoed through that Beverly Hills mansion on that cold December night in 1973 had indeed been the beginning of something new. Not the end of Doris Day the star, but the birth of Doris Day the woman, a woman who had found the courage to reclaim her life when it seemed lost forever, and who had learned that the most important performance of all is the brave daily act of being authentically yourself. In the end, Perhaps that was her greatest role. Not the innocent characters she had played on screen, but the complex, resilient, ultimately triumphant real woman she had fought so hard to become. The golden cage was empty now, its door standing open forever, a testament to the power of truth over manipulation, of courage over fear, and of authentic self-love over manufactured adoration. And in that freedom, Doris Day had finally found something more valuable than all the fame and fortune she had lost. She had found herself. Vegas, in those days, was a city of secrets, but no secret was as dark as this one. The Rat Pack continued performing. The crowds kept coming, but something had fundamentally changed. Frank would sometimes stop mid-song, his eyes distant, as if remembering that December night. Dean noticed it, Sammy noticed it, but nobody dared ask. In the months that followed, strange things began happening. People who had been in that room started having accidents. One drove off a cliff in California. Another had a heart attack at 42, perfectly healthy until that day. Frank knew these weren't coincidences. He started traveling with more bodyguards, stopped taking certain routes, wouldn't eat at restaurants he hadn't checked first. The Washington man called Frank regularly. Each call brought new demands. Frank had to arrange meetings, introduce certain people to certain circles. He became a bridge between two worlds that should never have connected. Every introduction he made, every hand he shook, pulled him deeper into a web he couldn't escape. Then came November 1963. Frank was in Los Angeles when he heard the news from Dallas. He locked himself in his room for 3 days. Tony Roma stood guard outside, turning everyone away. When Frank finally emerged, he looked like he'd aged 10 years. He knew what his signature had set in motion. The guilt would eat at him for the rest of his life. After Dallas, the calls stopped. The Washington man disappeared. Giancana acted like that night had never happened. But Frank couldn't forget. He started drinking more. His marriages crumbled. His relationship with his children strained. The world saw a superstar living the high life. But inside, Frank was drowning in secrets he could never share. In 1965, Frank tried to break free. He went to the FBI, wanted to tell everything. But when he arrived at the meeting, the agent already knew why he was there. On the agent's desk was a file, thick as a phone book. Frank's name was on it. The agent opened it, showed Frank a single page. It was enough. Frank left without saying a word. The cage had no doors. The following years brought more performances, more albums, more accolades. But every award felt hollow, every standing ovation, a reminder of what he'd lost that night in Vegas. When he sang songs about regret, about choices, about the road not taken, he wasn't performing, he was confessing. Frank's health began declining in the 1980s. The drinking had taken its toll, but it was more than that. The weight of secrets can kill a man slowly. During one of his last concerts, he stopped in the middle of The Way You Look Tonight and just stood there, silent, for a full minute. The audience thought it was emotion. It was memory. Tony Roma visited Frank regularly in his final years. They would sit in silence mostly, two old men carrying the burden of that December night. Sometimes Frank would ask Tony if he thought they'd be forgiven. Tony never answered. Some things are beyond forgiveness. In 1997, a year before Frank died, he gave Tony a sealed envelope. He made Tony promise not to open it until after both of them were gone. Tony kept that promise. Inside was Frank's confession, written in his shaky handwriting. Every detail of that night, every name, every threat, every regret. Frank wanted the truth known, but only when it couldn't hurt anyone still living. But here's what nobody knew until Tony's recording surfaced. There was another person in that room that night, a young woman, barely 20, who served drinks and was supposed to leave. But she didn't leave. She hid behind a curtain and heard everything. She was Giancana's niece, and she kept a diary. That diary surfaced in 2020, when her estate was settled. Her entries from December 1963 matched Tony's recordings perfectly, but she adds details Tony didn't know. The Washington man's real name, the exact nature of the Dallas plan, the names of everyone who would be eliminated to keep the secret. Frank's name was on that list too, but someone had crossed it out. A note in the margin said simply, "Too visible, natural causes." Frank lived another 35 years after that night, but in many ways, he died in that room on the 17th floor. The man who walked out wasn't the same one who walked in. He became a ghost haunting his own life, singing songs about a freedom he'd lost, a choice he'd surrendered, a soul he'd sold for a price he never wanted to pay. The saddest part is what Tony revealed in his final recording. Frank's last words to him, just days before he died. "Tony, I should have walked away. I should have let them destroy me. It would have been cleaner than this." Tony's voice breaks on the recording as he adds, "He was right. Some prices are too high, even for survival." When I first heard these recordings, I couldn't believe them. But then I started researching. Every date checks out. Every name Tony mentioned had connections to that world. The Washington man's identity, when I finally confirmed it, made my hands shake. This wasn't just about Frank. This was about the highest levels of power in America, about decisions that shaped history, about secrets that could still destroy lives today. The other members of the Rat Pack suspected something, but never knew the full truth. Dean Martin once told his son that Frank had changed after that December, that something had broken inside him. Sammy Davis Jr. wrote in a draft of his autobiography, later edited out, that Frank would sometimes look at him with such sadness, as if apologizing for something Sammy didn't understand. Peter Lawford knew more than the others. His connection to the Kennedys made him valuable and vulnerable. After that night, Frank gradually pushed Peter away. Not from anger, but from protection. Frank knew that anyone too close to the truth was in danger. Peter's decline into alcoholism and early death at 61 wasn't coincidental. He knew too much and couldn't live with it. Joey Bishop, the last surviving member of the Rat Pack, gave an interview in 2007, just months before his death. The interviewer asked him about Frank's transformation in the mid-60s. Joey stared at the camera for a long moment, then said, "Some stories should die with the people who lived them." He refused to elaborate, but his eyes said everything. The Sands Hotel was demolished in 1996. When they were clearing the 17th floor, construction workers found something strange. Behind a wall in the suite at the end of the corridor, there was a hidden compartment. Inside were recording devices, old but sophisticated for their time. The FBI was called. The devices were confiscated. The official report states nothing was found. But one of the workers took a photo before the FBI arrived. In the photo, you can see reels of tape. We'll never know what was on them. Frank's grave at Desert Memorial Park is simple. "The best is yet to come" is etched on his headstone. Visitors leave Jack Daniels bottles and cigarettes. But sometimes, you'll find a single red rose with a note that says only, "For the secrets you kept." Nobody knows who leaves them, but they appear every December, on the anniversary of that night. The real tragedy is that Frank spent his last decades trying to make amends in his own way. His charitable work, his support for civil rights, his dedication to helping young artists. It was all genuine, but it was also penance. He once told Tony that every good deed felt like trying to wash blood off his hands that only he could see. In one of the recordings, Tony mentions a moment that haunts me. After the meeting ended and everyone was leaving, Frank turned to Giancana and asked, "How do you live with it?" Giancana's response was chilling. "I don't live with it, Frank. I am it. Now so are you." That transformation, from Frank Sinatra the entertainer to Frank Sinatra the keeper of America's darkest secret, happened in just 3 hours on a December night in 1963. He walked into that room as one man and left as another. The world never knew the difference, but Frank lived with it every day until he drew his last breath. The most disturbing part of Tony's final recording is his revelation about why Frank was chosen. It wasn't just his connections or his influence. Giancana knew Frank's weakness, his loyalty to his friends. They knew he would do anything to protect the people he loved. They used his greatest virtue as the weapon to destroy him. Frank realized this too late, and the knowledge that his love for others had been weaponized against him was perhaps the cruelest cut of all. Today, most of the people involved are dead. The few who remain are in their 90s, taking their secrets to graves that are rapidly approaching. But the recordings exist. The diary exists. The evidence, scattered and hidden, tells a story that reshapes our understanding of that era. Frank Sinatra wasn't just an entertainer who knew dangerous people. He was a man forced to become a pivotal piece in a game so dangerous that even now, 60 years later, there are those who would kill to keep it buried. The last thing Tony recorded, just days before his own death, was a warning. If you're listening to this, be careful. They told us it was over when Frank died. They lied. It's never over. Some secrets are like radiation. They keep poisoning long after the source is gone. Frank knew this. He tried to warn me. Now I'm warning you. I've thought long and hard about sharing this story. The danger is real, even now. But Frank deserves to have his truth told. He wasn't just the voice or old blue eyes. He was a man caught in an impossible situation who paid the ultimate price. Not his life, but his soul. And he paid it to protect others, to prevent even worse outcomes, to navigate an impossible choice between personal destruction and becoming an accomplice to history's darkest moments. When you listen to Frank's music now, knowing what you know, you hear it differently. The melancholy in the wee small hours, the defiance in My Way, the resignation in That's Life. They weren't just songs. They were confessions hidden in plain sight, messages in bottles thrown into an ocean of audiences who could never understand their real meaning. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998, at 82 years old. The official cause was heart attack, but Tony Roma knew better. Frank had been ready to die for years. He'd been dying since December 1963. It just took his body 35 years to catch up with his spirit. The 17th floor of the Sands Hotel is gone now, but its ghosts remain. Sometimes, late at night in Vegas, old-timers say you can still hear music drifting through the desert air. I've Got You Under My Skin, the song that was playing when Frank Sinatra walked into that room and lost himself forever. This is the story that was buried for 60 years. This is the truth about the night that changed everything. And now that you know it, you understand why some secrets should never have been kept, and why some men pay prices that no amount of fame or fortune can ever redeem. Frank's final recording, made just weeks before his death, has him singing My Way one last time. But if you listen carefully, at the very end, after the music stops, you can hear him whisper something. Tony enhanced the audio. Frank's words are clear. Forgive me. We may never know who he was asking. Maybe all of us. Maybe none of us. Maybe God himself. But one thing is certain. Frank Sinatra went to his grave, carrying the weight of that December night in 1963, when the mob, the government, and forces beyond our understanding came together in a room on the 17th floor of the Sands Hotel and changed not just one man's life, but the course of American history itself. The best was yet to come? No. For Frank, the best ended that night in Vegas. Everything after was just a man trying to find redemption in a world that had already condemned him. And perhaps that's the greatest tragedy of all, that the voice that brought joy to millions was silenced by secrets he never wanted to keep, singing songs of freedom while living in the most elaborate prison ever constructed, the prison of truth, too dangerous to tell. In the scorching desert heat of Las Vegas, behind the darkened curtains on the top floor of the Desert Inn Hotel, lived a man who had become a ghost in his own lifetime. On that cold April morning in 1976, when Howard Hughes' lifeless body was discovered, the leather-bound journal found beside him containing 16 women's names would shock all of America. But the real secret wasn't in those names. It was in the one name that wasn't there. The woman he had erased from the list years ago with his own hands. The only one he truly loved, and the only one he destroyed completely. I knew Howard Hughes. Well, everyone knew him. Aviation mogul, film producer, one of America's richest men. But I knew him differently. I knew the man behind those blackened curtains. I knew his obsessions, his fears, and most of all his regrets. You see, I was one of the few people allowed into his world during those final years, and what I witnessed there still haunts me to this day. By the early 1970s, Hughes had completely withdrawn from the world. He had purchased the entire 9th floor of the Desert Inn, blocked out every window, and lived in that suite 23 hours a day. Nobody saw him anymore. Only his Mormon guards and a handful of loyal assistants could communicate with him. The man who once flew around the world in record time, who dated Hollywood's most beautiful stars, who built an empire from nothing, had become a prisoner in a cage of his own making. But when he died on April 5, 1976, what we found beside him would reveal Hollywood's darkest secret. I was the first to open the journal. The pages were aged, the ink had spread in places. But the names were readable. Katharine Hepburn, Ava Gardner, Jean Harlow, Ginger Rogers, Bette Davis, Rita Hayworth, Jane Russell, Faith Domergue, Terry Moore, Yvonne DiCarlo, Linda Darnell, Billy Dove, Carol Lombard, Olivia de Havilland, Jean Tierney, Susan Hayward. The list went on. Next to each name were dates, notes, numbers. Some had star marks beside them, others had crosses. It was like a scorecard of conquest, a catalog of possession. But on the first page, there was a name that had been blacked out, almost completely erased. Only the initials were barely visible. J.P. And beneath it, in Hughes's handwriting, a single sentence that chilled me to the bone. I killed her. Howard Hughes's story didn't really begin with that journal. It began in the late 1930s when he was still young, handsome, and seemingly invincible. When he first stepped into Hollywood, no one could have predicted he would become such an obsessive control freak. Money was just a tool for him. What he really wanted was control. Control over people, events, and most of all, control over women. His relationship with Katharine Hepburn was Hollywood's worst-kept secret. Two powerful personalities, two independent spirits, who seemed perfect for each other. But what nobody knew was how Hughes had Hepburn followed. Her phones tapped, even hidden microphones planted in her home. He needed to know everything, who she talked to, where she went, what she thought when he wasn't around. When Hepburn discovered this, she didn't rage or make a scene. She simply looked at him with those piercing eyes and said, "You're a sick man, Howard. I once loved you despite your sickness. Now I don't love you at all." The night he left Hepburn's house after that confrontation, Hughes understood for the first time what it meant to truly lose something. But this was just the beginning of his descent into madness. Ava Gardner was different, wild, uncontrollable, free, like a force of nature. When Hughes realized he couldn't possess her, he tried another tactic. He began to buy off, threaten, and destroy the life of every man Gardner loved. When she was with Frank Sinatra, Hughes tried to ban Sinatra from performing in any Las Vegas club he could influence. He had men follow them, photograph them, report their every move, but Gardner just laughed at him. "Money can't buy everything, Howard," she'd said, lighting a cigarette with that devil-may-care smile, especially not a woman's heart. But it was his treatment of Gardner that revealed the true darkness within Hughes. When she refused his marriage proposal in 1943, he didn't just accept it. He orchestrated a campaign to ruin every relationship she tried to have afterward. He would send anonymous letters to her lovers, have private investigators dig up dirt on them, even planted stories in gossip columns. Gardner later told friends that dating anyone while Hughes was interested in her was like trying to love someone while being stalked by a shadow that had unlimited resources and no conscience. Jean Harlow's story was even more tragic. Hughes had discovered her, made her a star, and then destroyed her. After Harlow's mysterious death, letters emerged revealing how Hughes had threatened her, prevented her from signing with other studios, even bribed her doctors to alter her medical reports. The platinum blonde bombshell, who had captivated America, was, behind the scenes, a prisoner. In her final days, Harlow told her mother, "Hughes keeps me in a golden cage. He clipped my wings, and now he's waiting for me to die." The truth about Harlow's death remained a Hollywood mystery for decades. But those who were close to the situation knew that Hughes's controlling behavior had driven her to desperate measures. She had been taking dangerous diet pills he provided, working inhuman hours he demanded, and living under constant surveillance he orchestrated. When she collapsed on set in 1937, Hughes initially refused to let her see a doctor who wasn't on his payroll. By the time she received proper medical attention, it was too late. His relationship with Ginger Rogers represented the peak of Hughes's obsessions. Rogers couldn't even go to the market without Hughes's men following her. One night, When Rogers tried to escape to her mother's house, Hughes forcibly brought her back and didn't allow her to leave for 3 days. Rogers would later describe this period. I felt like a prisoner. My crime was loving him, or at least thinking I did. The surveillance was so intense that Rogers found microphones in her dressing room, her car, even in the jewelry Hughes had given her. She discovered that every conversation she'd had for months had been recorded and transcribed. When she confronted Hughes about it, he didn't deny it. Instead, he said, "I need to know you're mine, completely mine. Every thought, every word, every breath." But among all these women, there was one Hughes truly loved, one he couldn't bear to lose. And her name wasn't in that journal, because Hughes had erased it with his own hands, as if by removing her name, he could erase the guilt of what he'd done to her. Jean Peters. Beautiful but ordinary by Hollywood standards. Not a major star in Hughes's glittering universe. Just a woman. But Hughes loved her differently. He didn't try to control her. Didn't have her followed. Didn't turn her life into hell. At least, not at first. When they married in 1957, Hughes was already beginning to change. His obsessions were growing. His fear of people intensifying. His phobia of germs preventing him from touching anyone. He couldn't touch Peters either. Throughout their marriage, they lived in the same house but in separate rooms. Hughes would stand outside Peters's door at midnight, unable to gather the courage to knock, standing there for hours in the darkness like a ghost haunting his own life. When Peters found him there one night, she asked, "Why don't you come in, Howard?" Hughes's answer was perhaps the most honest thing he ever said. "If I touch you, I'll contaminate you. You're the only clean thing I have left." But as Hughes's illness progressed, he began to control Peters too. He tapped her phones, prevented her from seeing friends, wouldn't let her leave the house. She endured it for 13 years, watching the man she loved slowly transform into a monster she didn't recognize. The tender moments became fewer, the paranoid episodes more frequent. He would accuse her of betraying him if she smiled at a delivery man, of conspiring against him if she talked to her sister on the phone. Peters tried to help him. She brought in doctors, psychiatrists, specialists, but Hughes refused to see them, convinced they were all part of a conspiracy to steal his money or have him declared insane. He trusted no one, not even the woman who had stood by him through his descent into madness. When they divorced in 1970, Hughes offered Peters $70 million for her silence. Peters refused. "I don't want your money, Howard," she'd said, her voice steady, but her eyes full of tears. "I just want to forget." That was the day Hughes erased Jean Peters' name from his journal. He scratched it out, crossed over it, tried to obliterate it completely. But the sentence he wrote below revealed everything. "I killed her." And in a way he had, not physically, but he had killed Peters' love for him, her trust, her hope. And Hughes knew it. He knew that of all the women he had tried to possess, she was the only one who had genuinely loved him. And he had destroyed that love with his own hands. In his final years, in that dark suite at the Desert Inn, Hughes would only watch films, the same films, over and over. And they were all films starring Jean Peters. His assistants would set up the same scene every night, the projection machine, the white screen, and Hughes's chair. Hughes would watch Peters for hours, sometimes crying, sometimes talking to himself, sometimes reaching out toward the screen as if he could touch her through time and space. One night, one of his assistants heard what Hughes was saying. "I love you, Jean. I always loved you. But I didn't know how to love you." Those 16 women in the journal were women Hughes had tried to own, control, purchase. But Jean Peters was different. She was the one woman Hughes truly loved, but didn't know how to love without destroying. The journal entries beside each woman's name told stories of manipulation and control. Next to Bette Davis's name, he had written, "Too independent, requires breaking." Beside Rita Hayworth, married to Orson Welles, must separate them. For Faith Domergue, whom he had discovered as a teenager, moldable, keep isolated. But the most disturbing entries were about the younger women. Linda Darnell, who died in a mysterious house fire in 1965, had a note beside her name. "Knows too much about Vegas operations. Jean Tierney, who suffered a nervous breakdown, had this notation: fragile psyche, useful for control. What emerged from these pages wasn't just a list of conquests. It was a blueprint for psychological manipulation on an industrial scale. Hughes had employed teams of private investigators, phone tappers, and informants. He had dossiers on each woman containing their fears, weaknesses, and secrets. He knew about Olivia de Havilland's family troubles, Susan Hayward's drinking problem, Billy Dove's financial vulnerabilities. Yet for all his power, all his money, all his elaborate schemes, Hughes couldn't buy what he really wanted: genuine love. The more he tried to control these women, the more they slipped away from him. And the more they slipped away, the tighter he tried to hold on, creating a vicious cycle that would ultimately leave him alone in that dark hotel room, surrounded by nothing but memories and regrets. I discovered something else in that room that day. Hidden behind a false panel in the wall, there was another journal. This one contained letters. Letters Hughes had written to Jean Peters but never sent. Hundreds of them, dating from their divorce until just weeks before his death. In these letters, a different Howard Hughes emerged. Not the controlling megalomaniac, but a broken man who understood too late what he had lost. One letter, dated Christmas Eve 1975, just months before his death, read, "Dear Jean, it's Christmas again, and I'm alone as always. I watch your films every night. In them, you're still young, still smiling, still looking at the camera with those eyes that once looked at me with love. I know I destroyed that love. I know I destroyed us. I turned our marriage into a prison, and you into a prisoner. You asked me once why I couldn't just love you simply, purely, the way normal people love. I didn't have an answer then. I do now. I was so afraid of losing you that I made losing you inevitable. I was so afraid you would leave that I made leaving your only choice. The other women meant nothing. They were challenges, games, possessions. You were the only one who was real. The only one who saw Howard, not Hughes. And I repaid that gift by trying to cage you like one of my planes in a hangar. Beautiful, but never allowed to fly." The letter continued. But what struck me most was the postscript. "I know you'll never read this. I'll never send it. But I need to write it, to tell someone, even if it's just this paper, that I'm sorry, that I loved you, that I still love you, that I'll die loving you." And he did. When Howard Hughes died on April 5, 1976, his last word, according to the aide who was with him, was Jean. The world mourned the eccentric billionaire, the aviation pioneer, the Hollywood mogul. But I knew we were really mourning a man who had everything except the ability to love without destroying. A man who turned every relationship into a transaction, every emotion into a strategy, every woman into a possession, except one, and she was the one he lost. After Hughes's death, I reached out to Jean Peters. She had remarried, built a new life, found peace. When I told her about the journals, the letters, Hughes's final word, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I'll never forget. "Howard was brilliant at everything except being human. He could build planes that touched the sky, but he couldn't touch another person without trying to own them. I loved him once, truly loved him. But you can't love someone who sees love as just another thing to acquire and control." She paused, then added, "Those 16 women in his journal, they were the lucky ones. They escaped with their lives and sanity intact. I almost didn't." But there was more to the story. After Hughes's death, several of the women on his list came forward with their own accounts. Ava Gardner revealed that Hughes had once held her captive in a hotel room for 3 days when she tried to break off their relationship. She escaped only by promising to marry him, then fled the country the next day. Terry Moore claimed she had secretly married Hughes on a yacht in international waters, though no legal proof ever surfaced. She spent decades fighting for a share of his estate, insisting she was his legal widow. Whether true or not, her story revealed the confusion and chaos Hughes left in his wake. Women who didn't know if they were lovers, captives, or wives. Faith Domergue, whom Hughes had discovered when she was just 16, wrote in her memoir about the years of psychological manipulation she endured. Hughes had convinced her that without him, she was nothing. He isolated her from her family, controlled her career, and monitored her every move. It took her years of therapy after leaving him to realize that she had been a victim of systematic abuse disguised as love. But perhaps the most tragic revelation came from the investigation into Linda Darnell's death. The house fire that killed her in 1965 had always been considered accidental, but investigators found evidence that Hughes had been having her watched until the day she died. There were suggestions, never proven, that the fire might not have been as accidental as it seemed. Darnell had been planning to write a tell-all book about her relationship with Hughes, including details about his connections to organized crime in Las Vegas. The truth was that Howard Hughes's need for control extended far beyond romantic relationships. These women were casualties in his war against his own demons. His germophobia, his paranoia, his desperate need to control everything in a world that felt increasingly chaotic to his fractured mind. In his final years, Hughes lived on codeine and Valium, eating only chocolate bars and drinking only milk. His 6'4" frame withered to barely 90 pounds. His fingernails grew inches long, his hair reached his shoulders, and he spent days in darkness watching those same films of Jean Peters, trying to recapture something that had been lost forever. The Mormon aides who cared for him reported that he would sometimes have moments of clarity, usually in the early morning hours. During these moments, he would cry like a child and beg them to call Jean, to tell her he was sorry, to ask her to come see him one last time. But they never made those calls. Hughes had given strict instructions years earlier that no one was ever to contact her on his behalf. One aide told me about a particularly haunting incident just weeks before Hughes died. Hughes had been watching Pickup on South Street, one of Jean Peters' films, when he suddenly started screaming at the projection screen, I'm sorry, please come back, please forgive me." He collapsed in his chair, sobbing uncontrollably. When the aide tried to comfort him, Hughes pushed him away, saying, "Don't touch me, I'm poison, I destroy everything I touch." The aide said it was the only time he ever saw Hughes show genuine emotion about anything other than his fears and paranoia. When the contents of Hughes's estate were cataloged, they found something extraordinary. In addition to the planes, the hotels, the millions in cash and stocks, there was a storage facility containing thousands of hours of surveillance recordings, hundreds of thousands of photographs, and detailed reports on dozens of women dating back to the 1940s. It was an archive of obsession, a monument to one man's inability to distinguish between love and possession. Among these materials were recordings of Jean Peters that Hughes had made secretly during their marriage, hours of her talking on the phone to friends, singing to herself while cooking, even sleeping. The investigators who heard these tapes described them as deeply disturbing, not because of their content, but because of the complete violation of privacy they represented. Here was a man so desperate to possess his wife completely that he recorded her every breath, as if by capturing these moments he could somehow own her soul. But the most revealing discovery was a series of recordings Hughes had made of himself, apparently intended as a kind of confession or memoir. In these rambling, often incoherent monologues, Hughes talked about his relationships with women, his fears, his regrets. One recording, dated just months before his death, contained this statement: "They all think I was a playboy, a Casanova. They don't understand. I wasn't collecting women, I was trying to find the one I lost. Every woman after John was just an attempt to recreate what we had, to prove I could do it right this time. But you can't recreate something you destroyed. You can't rebuild something from ashes. John was real. Everything after her was just shadows, just echoes of something that died the day she looked at me and said she didn't know who I was anymore." He continued, "I remember the exact moment I lost her. It wasn't when she filed for divorce. It wasn't when she walked out. It was 2 years before that, at breakfast. She was reading the newspaper, and she looked up at me, and there was nothing in her eyes. No love, no hate, just nothing. Like she was looking at a stranger. That's when I knew I had killed whatever we had. But I kept trying to control her anyway, because I didn't know what else to do. Control was all I knew." The recording went on for hours, a stream of consciousness that revealed a man tortured by his own nature, unable to change even when he understood the destruction he caused. After everything came to light, Several of the women from Hughes's list were asked if they forgave him. Ava Gardner, always direct, said, "Forgive him, honey. I survived him. That's enough." Ginger Rogers was more philosophical. Howard was a man at war with himself. He wanted love, but was terrified of vulnerability. He wanted intimacy, but couldn't stand being truly known. In the end, his fear won, and we all paid the price. But it was Terry Moore who perhaps summed it up best. Howard Hughes had everything a man could want: money, power, fame, his pick of beautiful women. But he was the poorest man I ever knew, because he couldn't do the one thing that makes us human. He couldn't love without conditions. As for John Peters, she lived quietly until her death in 2000. She rarely spoke about Hughes publicly, maintaining her dignity and privacy to the end. But in one of her last interviews, she said something that haunted me. "People ask me if I regret marrying Howard. I don't regret loving him. The man he was when we met was worth loving. What I regret is staying so long, hoping he would become that man again. But that man died long before Howard did. What was left was just a ghost haunting both of us." She was asked if she ever forgave him. Her response was simple: "I forgave him the day I realized he was sicker than he was cruel." But forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. And it doesn't mean the damage wasn't real. The 16 women in Howard Hughes's journal represented different chapters in his descent into madness. Each relationship showed his progression from a controlling but functional person to someone completely consumed by paranoia and obsession. But Jean Peters, the erased name, the ghost in the journal, she represented something else entirely. She was proof that Howard Hughes was once capable of real love, and the tragedy that he destroyed that capacity with his own hands. In the end, Howard Hughes died, as he had lived his final years, alone. Surrounded by wealth that couldn't buy him peace, power that couldn't give him control over his own demons, and memories of women he had tried to possess but never truly had. The journal found beside his deathbed wasn't just a list of conquests. It was a catalog of failures, a testament to a man who had everything except the ability to love and be loved in return. The saddest part of Howard Hughes's story isn't that he died alone in that hotel room. It's that he had spent the last 20 years of his life as a prisoner of his own making, watching films of the one woman who had truly loved him, knowing he had destroyed that love, and being completely powerless to undo the damage. Those 16 names in his journal were his attempt to fill the void Jean Peters left behind. But you can't fill a void shaped like genuine love with possession and control. You can't replace a real connection with surveillance and manipulation. And you can't buy back a soul you've already sold to your own obsessions. Howard Hughes conquered the skies, built an empire, and became one of the richest men in history. But he couldn't conquer his own nature. He couldn't build a real relationship. And all his riches couldn't purchase the one thing he wanted most: a second chance with the only woman who had loved Howard the man, not Hughes the legend. When they cleaned out his hotel suite after his death, they found one last thing. On the wall behind his bed, barely visible in pencil, someone had written, "Jean, forgive me." Whether Hughes wrote it or just imagined it, we'll never know. But those two words, faint and desperate on that wall, might be the most honest thing Howard Hughes ever said. The man who had tried to own the world died owning nothing that mattered. The man who had tried to control everyone died with no control over his own fate. And the man who had 16 women in his journal died with only one name on his lips, the one he had erased, the one he had lost, the one he had loved and destroyed in equal measure. That journal, with its 16 names and one erasure, now sits in a vault somewhere. A reminder that all the money in the world can't buy you the ability to love properly, and that sometimes the most powerful people are the weakest when it comes to the only thing that really matters: connecting with another human being without trying to own them. Howard Hughes wanted to possess beauty, control love, and own people's hearts, the way he owned hotels and airlines. But hearts aren't properties. Love isn't a contract, and the women in his life weren't collectibles. They were human beings who deserved more than being entries in a madman's journal. The ghost of Jean Peters haunts this story, not because she died. She lived a long life after Hughes, but because she represents what could have been. If Hughes had been capable of loving without controlling, of trusting without surveilling, of connecting without possessing, his story might have been very different. Instead, Howard Hughes's legacy is a cautionary tale about the price of treating love like a business transaction and people like possessions. Those 16 women in his journal survived him, but they all carried scars from their time in his orbit. And Jean Peters, the erased name, carried perhaps the deepest scars of all, not because she loved him the least, but because she loved him the most, and he destroyed that love with the very hands that had once held her.